I just came back from Russia, actually, and my question is, I'm quickly going to describe two characters I met. One was a middle-aged professional. He went to the protests just a year ago, but he was sure to buy a book from a nearby bookstore, so if he got caught by the police, he could say, I don't know, I was just buying a book. And I saw a little bit of fear that he didn't want to get caught. Another one was a middle-aged business owner who didn't know that Putin was reelected the last time. He was completely disengaged from the political process. He thought it was all pointless. Do you think either the fear or the apathy is a greater threat to the progression of democracy in Russia, or something completely different?
Oh, very good. I think fear is fading a little bit, at least in the cities, in Moscow and St. Petersburg. They've repeatedly brought enough people into the streets that people know they're not alone. Their contact was very clever. He had a good backup plan. And apathy is shrinking in the big cities. Out in the countryside, it's not countryside, but in smaller centers, there is a lot of apathy. There's a sense that this is, after the message repeated on state media that, life is better now than it was under the Yeltsin years has been absorbed, and the progress sticks with them. And even in Moscow, I remember the sort of what was supposed to be the big protest against Putin. And I called my editors up and I said, they're going to go for it. They're going to go and try and do the whole Orange Revolution in Moscow, because my contacts were saying we're going to pitch tents and we're going to stay. We're not going to leave until the fall of the regime. This is the spring of 2012. And then later on, as the evening progressed, I saw people sort of packing up, and they were all. I started asking people, I thought this was staying, and most people were saying, I got to work in the morning, and the kids got daycare, and there is, so Putin. What I'm trying to say there is, it's not apathy, but he's insulated a little bit. At least he was in 2012 by the fact that there was a functioning economy and things were good enough. Like, people weren't at the desperation point where they were just going to stay in the streets for 6 months until they got changed, because they had too much to lose. And I think the betting with the Western sanctions has been that they can sort of force the Russian society to that point where they're going to want to seek a change. And it hasn't yet worked from my recent trips there. You were there more recently than I, but it didn't feel like it was on the brink of anything. And if anything, I think we're looking at another very familiar scene next year where Putin gets reelected. There are a few protests, and then we're back to waiting for 2024.
Thanks.
I'm just curious, have you ever come across a story that you wanted to write about but were denied either by your editor or publisher because it went against the mainstream Western narrative in some capacity?
That's I mean, the book that I wrote, and I'm not trying to boost sales from 9 to 10 here tonight by talking about it, but when it came out, one of the guy who was the deputy foreign editor said to me, he said, why didn't you write about this for us? I mean, because it was an examination of how U.S. funded groups were sort of aiding in the revolutions in Ukraine and Georgia, and because it suited a certain political agenda. It also looked at how the Kremlin was pushing back, and that was the new Cold War was about how it was being fought on street politics, and that to a certain extent at that point. And the answer was that I had actually talked to them about it repeatedly on the phone, but they never seen it as a story in their minds, because it didn't. It just sounded like, well, these guys they're Westerners, they're doing good over there. NDI and IRI and these groups that I focused on in my book. So I don't think it was, it wasn't anything like where they said, no, you can't write that. It never happened. They never tell me, no, you can't write that. But there's some things that they're not interested in, certainly in the past, that it just didn't reach them as a story. Nowadays, I mean, I'll be honest, they don't tell me what to write. I don't have a restriction. They're pretty, I mean, after 15 years of doing this, if I say this is what I'm working on, they're usually pretty supportive. But that was a big example where I literally had said to them 5-6 times, like, this is what I think the real story is. And they kept going, write about the happy street protests again. And so I turned it into a book because I was frustrated, really.
And there aren't as many editors as there used to be.
Yeah,
so.
Exactly.
Yeah, next.
Hi, Mark. Thanks for being here. Considering the crackdown on the media in Russia over the past few years, I was wondering if you've ever encountered any roadblocks in your work, whether you were gathering sources or writing an article, and how did you move past these?
And this gets to what I was saying about the different authoritarian regimes. I had a funny experience 2 summers ago. I went to Perm in central Russia to write about how the city had, briefly been sort of had an experiment to sort of create a very pro-Western cultural space, or just a different cultural space than the rest of Russia. They had museums that were more risky and a music scene that was very edgy, and then Kremlin changed the governor, and that whole experiment got closed down. But I got there, and I was at one of the only Gulag museum. It's just outside of Perm. It's basically, you're walking around what was once a Gulag, and you can see what it was like there. And I was walking up, and some woman walks up to me, and she goes, I'm not going to try a Russian accent. She goes, "Mark Mackinnon, I read on Wikipedia that you interviewed the King of Jordan. Why are you here?" And so, I definitely felt they were aware of what I was doing, where I was going, and I once came back from reporting in Chechnya to find that my satellite phone had ended up in the shower somehow. It was, again, sort of a feeling that someone was paying attention. But honestly, in terms of obstruction, I've had much bigger problems in other places, in Syria, Uzbekistan, China. I mean, the biggest concern in these places often is for the sources, and the people you're talking to, they may not understand sometimes the risks they're taking, and you have to walk a very fine line between making sure they're aware of the risk they're taking and not making yourself part of the censorship apparatus. Like, you don't want to tell people you can't say that, because that's the opposite of what we should be trying to do there. But at the same time, you want to make sure they're cognizant of what they're getting into. And my last trip to Syria before I was banned from the country, and this is like a decade ago, I was doing a piece on the democracy movement there, and they were very clear. They knew what they were doing, what risks they were taking. There's a guy named Anwar al-Buni that I interviewed, and the day after I interviewed him, he was at a stoplight, and someone just punched him and broke his jaw. And he assumed this was a regime policeman. And his brother called me and said, "Anwar's in hospital. He got beaten up after he talked to you." And I said, "Oh, God, that's terrible. I'm really sorry." He goes, No, he wants you to come and interview him again." And so, very proud of that guy. He's now in exile. Anyway, so yeah, it's a very difficult line. But Russia, again, like there's a scale to these sort of repressive states. And Russia, maybe because I've worked there for so long, I don't... trying to report in China was honestly a lot more difficult than trying to report in Russia.
Okay. And I think this will be our last one if no one else emerges.
Make it a good one.
Thank you. Yeah,
No pressure.
No pressure. Yeah, and that doesn't help. But thank you. And thank you for coming to talk. You said earlier your job was now, but I'm sure to some extent always, to connect the dots. How do you do that, particularly when bureaus are closing and journalists don't have the time necessarily to be in one place anymore, particularly if you're working somewhere where you can't get always around as easily as you'd like? Mm-hmm. How do you tell a big story when sometimes all you have to work from are little stories?
The one that I'm proudest of that I did recently was we were doing sort of classic response journalism, and it was in London, and I was interviewing Chrystia Freeland, actually. She'd come, she was then the trade minister, and all of a sudden, all the beeps on the phone started happening, and there had been a truck attack in Nice in France. And my editors were called within minutes and said, "Can you get down there?" I said, "Yes, I can." So I flew down to Nice, and by the weekend, there was a coup in Turkey. And they said, "Can you get there?" I said, "Yes, I can." And then, afterwards, my editors were like, "Is there anything that connects these things?" I said, "God, no, there isn't. This is the most ridiculous assignment ever." But when you stopped and thought about it, and you realized sort of that there were connective tissue, not immediately obvious, but just the sense that, as I was saying earlier, that the world's spinning a little bit more out of control these days, and that the fact that people who voted for Brexit were generally people who had lost out in globalization and were angry about that, and those are the same people who were supporting Erdogan in Turkey as he took this more nationalistic turn, and they were in a different way the same people who were sort of lashing out of desperation and joining some a group like ISIS or Daesh to strike out at the more affluent people around them. And so it was, yeah, it's difficult sometimes to try and piece together things that seem to make no sense at all, that seem like they're very different. But I think the Globe has gotten a lot better at just saying, take a week off and think about this stuff. And that's, and then you really pour over your notebooks and you go, that person said the same thing as that person. And the context is completely different, but there's a common heartbeat to these stories. And from that story, when I was interviewing, I called Margaret Mackinnon, the history professor, up, and I asked her, did she see any connection between these events? And she said, no, we're in this great period of uncertainty, she called it, and it's like it reminded her of interwar periods. And from that discussion, my editors were like, they're fascinated by that idea. So they asked me, well, where did that begin? And that's how we started our hunt for the graffiti kids of Syria. So it just came from not. It's an interesting thing because it came from running to all these events, and then it came from stopping running for a little while and just trying to think about what happened. And that, when I started out in journalism, we didn't do much stopping and thinking. It was all, what are you filing for tomorrow's paper? And I'm glad that period has eased.